Let's bring in some reaction. International Relations Analyst Aaliyah Vayez joins us for more on this conversation. Aaliyah, very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. South Africa, we know, essentially stunned the world in December when it launched its genocide case against Israel. 10 months on, we're now here. Exactly how significant is this move?
Thank you so much for having me, Paul. I think it's incredibly significant, purely based off of the sheer amount of evidence South Africa is submitting. We've heard, while the evidence isn't public, we've heard there's over 4,000 annexes which prove South Africa's case, or rather case against Israel, proving its genocidal intent. But I think more so we need to focus on what South Africa was really trying to do with this amount of evidence, and that is specifically linking government officials or government statements by the Israeli government or by the Israeli government officials to the programmatic nature of destruction that Israel has caused in the past year in Palestine. We've seen casualties reaching over 43,000 Palestinian deaths. And I think, again, another point to emphasize is that South Africa is really saying that acknowledging that while the events of October 7th by Hamas took place, the military reaction by the Israeli government and the Israeli occupation forces in the form of the IDF, in the form of, the ongoing bombardment that we see in Gaza taking place as we speak right now, it completely exceeds the proportionality. So I think South Africa has made an incredible statement. I commend our country. I commend our country's legal team for the sheer amount of work that's gone into this, but also, again, putting forward Palestine's case on the international stage.
You mentioned over 42,000 Palestinians being killed, mostly comprising of women and children, and more than 100 hostages are still believed, as you and I speak, to be in captivity in Gaza. What do you make of the timing of this memorial being filed, considering what continues to escalate on the ground?
I think there's several things that are happening at the same time, Paul. And yes, of course, one of them being the fact that Israel, continues its bombardment of the Gaza Strip. Particularly, we've seen gruesome and horrific images coming out of northern Gaza where, Palestinians are being rounded up and taken to God knows where. We've seen Israel's actions in Lebanon. We've seen, the ongoing actions of Israeli defense forces, which, in arguably constitute terrorism across the West Bank. And I think, we've got this particular reality in Israel and Palestine, but on the other side, we've got, for example, the 79th anniversary of the signing of the UN Charter, which upholds, international institutions, international principles of humanitarian law, which govern, the way states act with one another and within themselves. And I think the timing is exceptionally important to consider. The more Israel continues their genocidal acts against people in Palestine with, unprecedented levels of impunity as a Western, nation-backed state, we're starting to see, over and over again, the credibility of international institutions like the United Nations, like the United Nations Security Council, like principles of international law, like the Genocidal Convention be questioned, their credibility crumbling, as Israel continues to act with this level of impunity, as well as, ongoing backing by Western states like the United States, like the United Kingdom, like Germany, whether it's militarily, whether it's diplomatically. We're really, one might say, go so far as to say the international system is in crisis.
On the back of that, Israel has failed to comply with international obligations. The devastation and suffering that has been made possible despite the ICJ and numerous UN bodies' actions and interventions. Israel has been granted unprecedented impunity to breach international laws and norms. I mean, all of this is still happening, irrespective of who says what. I mean, that in itself speaks volumes.
Yeah, it does, and we're seeing, our own South African Special Rapporteur for Human Rights, Tlaleng Mofokeng, or Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng, call every single day alongside several high-level United Nations officials, including the Secretary General, call for a ceasefire, call for the, the access of humanitarian aid to be granted to all parts of the Gaza Strip. And as we speak today in the Knesset, which is the Israeli legislature, we see two bills, being debated in the House, which aim to block all access for UNRWA, or the United Nations Refugee and Works Agency, which is the biggest provider of humanitarian aid to Palestinians and has been for decades now. Those bills are aimed at making it impossible for UNRWA to continue its vital and life-saving work. I think this is an incredible moment for the world to once again reflect on the fact that Israel's actions continue to go unpunished, absolutely unscathed in the eyes of the West. And I think, it's exceptional in the sense that this is happening now, as opposed to other cases of genocide, for example, Rwanda, where it was brought to international courts or the international system in hindsight. Again, we're seeing real-time documentation. I think it was psychologist Dr. Gabor Mate that says we're witnessing a genocide on TikTok. Which is, again, a world first. And again, this implicates a Western-backed state, which is, again, unprecedented. And I think, once more, this is a time for the world to really reflect and stand behind South Africa. And I know more and more countries, including most recently Bolivia, have come, as parties to this case, because this cannot go on.
Yeah, a host of countries filing interventions there and their applications to the court in support of South Africa on the one hand, Aaliyah, but critics, on the other hand, accuse South Africa of theatre, political opportunism, and even perhaps double standards. What position does this advancement place South Africa, more so as we look to the potential ripple effects on its international relations and amid what some may say is between potentially grave diplomatic risks?
I think these criticisms that you've mentioned, especially on a diplomatic front, were lodged against South Africa when we first made our case in December 2023. And I think you can see from the events of the past year, South Africa has not wavered. In fact, this is the very filing of this case is very much within South Africa's foreign policy agenda, very much within its historical, image on the international stage, as being a proponent of human rights, as being a proponent of conflict resolution through reconciliation with our history of apartheid. So I think this is not a surprise move by South Africa by any means. And I think over the past year, the events of for example, just this past week's BRICS summit has shown that South Africa is number one, not giving up on this case, not pulling back by any means, and number two, not suffering diplomatically, if I can say that. Yeah. We're very much still engaging with our international partners in the West and outside of the West, and we're very, President Cyril Ramaphosa said at the BRICS summit last week, which we know had the eyes of the world or the attention of the world, he very much mentioned Palestine and South Africa's support for Palestine, which again shows that our country is unwavering, unafraid, and will continue to support Palestine and Palestinians going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for weighing in on this conversation. We're going to have to leave it there for now. International Relations Analyst Aaliyah Vayez expanding on that conversation as we, of course, continue to take a look at the impact throughout the course of the evening.